So I will be voting to leave the European Union, and it's a sentence which might perplex some people who know me. I'm a DPhil student here, I'm a Labour Party member, and a democratic socialist. But it's not a view that really should be surprising, for it's not in spite of the values which led me to the Labour Party that lead me to support Brexit, but it's because of them. My decision to vote leave is based on my values of democracy, socialism, and the belief in a political economy which protects the living standards of working people. So this evening I want to set out why I believe that there is a strong Labour case for leaving the EU. But first, a bit of history. While it may not seem like it now, Euroscepticism has had a strong and vibrant tradition in the Labour Party. Figures from its left, right and centre have at various points in its history come out against the EU or its predecessor organisations. From Clement Attlee, Ernie Bevan, Hugh Gaitskell, Dennis Healey, Michael Foot, Tony Benn, Barbara Castle, and until 9 months ago, Jeremy Corbyn. While Labour MPs and members are now unquestionably more pro-EU than they have ever been in the party's history, Labour supporters still remain within that tradition of Euroscepticism. 1/3 of people who voted Labour at the last general election are planning to vote Leave on the 23rd of June. And it seems that 1/3 of Labour supporters is drawn disproportionately from the party's historic but increasingly perilous working class base. As I've said elsewhere, as a matter of at least electoral strategy, the Labour Party must not send the signal to those people that if they vote to leave on the 23rd of June, then Labour is no longer their party. And I fear that at the moment, the Labour Party is doing its best to turn those people away. So what are my reasons for wanting to leave the EU? Well, my first is a fundamental objection that has to do with democracy. Tony Benn described the EU as a political coup d'etat by a political class that do not trust their own people. And it's a view that unfortunately is shared by some on the left in Britain. It's this sense that only the EU and its institutions can protect us from conservative governments. But while we in Britain, when we get fed up with Tory governments, can get rid of them, there is nothing that we can do about an EU Commission that is dominated by the right.
Nonsense.
The EU executive, it's true, John, we can get rid of 1 out of 28 commissioners. The EU executive has regularly overridden the democratic will of people across Europe, no more so than in Greece, where one EU actor said after the election of the Syriza government, quote, "We can't possibly allow an election to change anything." Labour supporters often point to the social rights that we receive as members of the European Union, and I certainly understand that perspective. But there is no law which we get by being members of the EU when it comes to workers' rights that we cannot achieve on our own. The Labour MP Gisela Stewart has pointed out that many of the rights that workers and women have received, which are credited to the EU, were in fact initiatives of Labour governments. I'm sure no one more so would agree with that than the late Barbara Castle, the author of the Equal Pay Act 1970 and a passionate campaigner for Brexit in 1975. There are those on the left who fear that by leaving we will lose those rights. But we must have greater confidence in ourselves and the British people. The best way to protect ourselves from conservative governments is not to vote for them. And it's down to the Labour Party to make the case for people in Britain to elect us as their government. My second objection to the EU is on socialist grounds. I fear that our membership of the EU will seriously hinder a future Labour government from achieving its objectives. The recently deceased Dennis Healey once said, quote, "No socialist party with the prospect of forming a government could accept a system by which important fields of national policy were surrendered to a supranational European representative authority." And there are Labour policies which we currently hold which we would not be able to fully implement because of our membership of the EU. For example, Labour's renationalisation agenda for the railways, the postal service and so on is not achievable under current EU laws which stipulate that there must be private competition. Full-scale renationalisation is simply not allowed. State aid to failing industries, such as the steel industry, is prohibited under European state aid provisions. Labour's promise to abolish zero-hour contracts, I fear, would face challenge under EU law, which prohibits member states from implementing, quote, "unjustified and disproportionate restrictions on agency work." The problem is not just the EU placing hurdles for a future Labour government. The argument there can be that we can reform it from within. I understand that view. But this is something more fundamental. As the economist Paul Mason said, the austerity that we deride in Britain as a political choice is in fact written into the EU treaties as a non-negotiable obligation. And in recent years we have seen the EU actively working against left-wing objectives with alarming speed and aggressiveness. The EU Central Bank is committed by treaty to prioritise deflation and stagnation over growth, which has led to the gross unemployment that we see throughout the continent. The EU Commission has attacked collective bargaining and trade union activities and what it views as uncompetitive European economies. It has forced cuts to public sector pay, reduced or frozen minimum wages, and restricted pay agreements in the name of greater market competition. And the treatment of Greece in particular has been contemptible. EU institutions and actors have deliberately driven Greece deeper into recession, imposed austerity, and forced privatisation in direct contravention to the democratic will of the Greek people and their government. And we see also threats from the European courts. The ECJ's ruling in the Viking Line case allows a company to use its address in one EU member state, in this case it was Estonia, to avoid trade union obligations in a country where they do business, in this case it was Finland, if those labour rights make the business's contract, quote, less attractive. Additionally, the ECJ has restricted the right to take industrial action when it comes against a firm's, quote, freedom of establishment in another EU member state. So in the Laval case, a Swedish trade union was prevented from taking industrial action against a Latvian firm which refused to obey Swedish trade union agreements for higher pay, holidays and social insurances. So I agree with Jeremy Corbyn when he wrote in 2009, quote, "The EU project has always been to create a huge free market in Europe with ever-limiting powers for national governments." And while I admit that the Labour Party's prospects for returning to government may not seem particularly bright at the moment, I also believe that we will arise from this period of civil war, as we have at every other point in our history where we have fought amongst ourselves. And when that happens, I do not want a future Labour government fighting with its hand tied behind its back by an increasingly pro-austerity, pro-privatisation and anti-trade union EU.